Emotion is fascinating. We don't even have to understand emotion to understand that this is at least true. If, however, we do decide to place awareness on emotion, then we ultimately start to see that it's more than fascinating. We start to see that existentially, emotion is everything. Even at its most basic levels, it's completely necessary. Our very instinct to survive is the result of emotion, the emotion fear. Emotion is also the earliest form of human communication. An infant's display of its emotion helps its guardian assess its needs. So right away, we already have survival and communication. And these are both pretty important aspects of existing. And once again, these are just basic levels of emotion. So as always, let's dig a little deeper. Throughout human history, every twist, turn, pivot, every decision, every milestone that resulted from these decisions, in every nook and cranny, emotion can likely be found as, if not both, the cause or effect of each experience. Emotion is the motion of each of our experiences, and it gives meaning to each and every one of these experiences. And these experiences shape and mold us into who we become. So really, we are our emotions. Our emotions are us. So how and why is this significant? Well, just for a moment, reflect on the overall experience you've had so far in being human. Think about the times you've felt emotion, especially strongly felt it, and think about your responses to it. When things make us feel good, we typically embrace the experience, but how about when things don't feel so good? Now, every human at some point has fought against unfavorable experiences and ultimately the unfavorable feelings they bring. And that's normal. And in fact, it's sometimes necessary to place things on the back burner. We all have our own limit on what we can thoroughly handle at one time, and it's important to adhere to that limit. Oftentimes, though, we allow this to become a sort of a crutch, which eventually turns into a habit of only opening the door to experiences which are emotionally convenient. And this is obviously unhealthy, and it can have some pretty significant consequences for the mind, the body, and the soul, which I'll further discuss momentarily. But at this point, you might be wondering why, if it's unhealthy, is it our instinct to resist what we call negative emotion? Well, I suspect this is at least partly due to a misunderstanding of the true nature of emotion. You see, typically we come to think of emotion as an external force, something that's happening to us as opposed to something happening within us. On the contrary, though, emotion is a natural and internal flow. To see an example of the true and natural display of emotion, look at an infant or a toddler. Notice how they have little to no resistance or control of emotion. They actually act as a pure reflection of their emotion. And this shows that we're actually born with a natural and unhindered embrace of emotion, and that emotional resistance is learned later in life. Now, it could be argued that since infants and toddlers aren't developed enough to always verbally express their needs and wants, that it's then necessary for complete emotional projection. And I would say that on some level, to an extent, this is true, but if this were the case completely, then such projections would be diminished on some level as we grow. But as we all know, adults and children alike project their emotions. No matter how old we get, and no matter how much we develop, we still cry even if we try to fight it. We still laugh even if we try to hide it. And we still get scared even if we try to think ourselves out of it, and so on and so forth. Infants have certain super abilities that diminish over time because the need for such strong abilities diminishes over time. And for example, let's look at the brain. The connections between neurons are called synapses. On average, the adult brain has about 300, while the average toddler brain has around 1,000. And as they grow older, the brain purges the connections that aren't needed. So why wouldn't the same process apply to emotion? Well, it's because emotion is necessary. The developing mind and body knows what it's doing. And I'm not saying an adult should be like a toddler and throw a tantrum every time something doesn't go their way. Emotional control is an existential necessity, but that is the key word, control. And in a lot of cases, somewhere down the line, we allow resistance to replace control because it's easier. And most of the time, this isn't likely a conscious choice, but rather our subconscious deciding that it's easier to not have to screen every little emotion in real time. But if we set the intent to and utilize mindfulness, we can both have better control of our emotions and a more full embrace of them. And that's both positive and negative. And on that note, let's go back to earlier when I had mentioned resisting negative emotion, opening the door only to emotions which please us, and the potential adversities and consequences it could have. Have you ever wondered what happens to an emotion if it gets ignored, rejected, or put on hold for too long? If we hold true to the idea that our emotions and ourselves are one and the same, then casting a shadow on one's emotions will ultimately it'll cause a shadow to be cast on themselves. These unembraced and unappreciated emotions eventually start to assemble together and add to the part of us that we know as the shadow self. Now, the shadow self refers to portions and aspects of our personality that we remain unconscious to. This notion was first proposed by Carl Jung, who stated that when we reject and repress certain aspects of ourselves, we force them down into our unconscious psyche, and in a sense, they become hidden from our view by the shadow we cast onto them. And these ignored aspects will progressively start to project themselves as behaviors such as judging others harshly or pointing out one's own flaws in another, being quick-tempered, playing the victim. I mean, you know the drill. And now you can make an entire video, and countless people have, on a detailed discussion of shadow work. And since I have more than that to discuss, we'll stick to a brief overview of it. But if you've been working on growth, either personal or spiritual, and you feel like you just keep hitting a wall, then it might be time to start shadow work. Now, opening the floodgates to all the feelings, emotions, and aspects of yourself that you did not want to see, both consciously and subconsciously, it's not a leisurely task, so prepare yourself. It's emotionally intense, it's uncomfortable, it can be draining and exhaustive, and without the proper stability, some would say it can be psychologically dangerous. But this is really one of those instances where the only way out is through, because if these behaviors go unrecognized while more and more ignored emotion builds, this can lead to an emotional breakdown. Let's take an analogous look at it. Imagine if right now you heard someone knocking at your door. You get up to see who it is, and lo and behold, there's one of your friends at the door, and they're super happy. You'd more than likely let them in, not tell them to go away. Now, imagine the same scenario, except this time, your friend is sad. What do? It likely would not be easy to tell them to shove off, even if your reasons for doing so seemed okay. If you let the sadness in your space, you have to feel and deal with the sadness. So what do? Do you A, let them in, or B, deny them entrance? I'll give you a few seconds to decide. Wow, okay, interesting choice. Remember your decision and let's restart the scenario, but replace the friend. Let's replace the friend with yourself. Now, same as before, you get a knock on the door, but it's yourself. You're super happy. Do you embrace that happiness and let it in, or send it off and cast a shadow on it? It's safe to say that most of the time we're going to open the door for a happy us. But what if you answered the door to your sad self? Do you A, let the sad you inside, or B, ignore your sad self? Does it match with your previous answer? Now, you get bonus points if you ponder on why you answered the way you did. If you're unsure exactly why you chose the way you did, well, then there's a good chance that that was your shadow self that answered for you. But even if you know exactly why you chose how you did, the analogy is still relevant. Here's the thing, we can cast shadows on all we want, on any emotion we choose, but sometimes emotion will go rogue and it'll knock harder and harder and become more and more disruptive until ultimately it breaks down the door. And when your emotions break down the door, you refuse to answer for them, they then force themselves in. This is an emotional breakdown, but this doesn't have to happen. As I said earlier, though, sometimes the only way out is through. You can peacefully send whatever emotion on its way, but you first have to let it in. You open the door, see a broken you let yourself in, you listen to it, explain why it feels the way it does. You ask questions to further understand what you currently don't. And then comes our turn to respond to our emotional self. We tell it we understand it, we comfort it, we remember that we are it. We bond with it, we console it, then we tell it our side. You'll be listened to just as intently as you listened. After you've finished telling what you need to tell, you're now on mutual terms with yourself. It's at this point we can tell the emotion that it's time to go. And when it leaves, it leaves. It won't linger and it won't keep knocking because it's been resolved. Of course, though, it will be back again. But now that you've been acquainted, it shouldn't be as much of a problem for you to handle the same situation the same way. This is the importance of opening the door to emotion.